Good evening. Welcome to the 66th session in the Book of Acts, at least according to my notes. I'd like to start this evening with a reading of Psalm 116, which I read just 5 months ago in this class, but it pertains to what we're going to be talking about. 5 months. We've been in this book for a long time, over a year now. Psalm 116. I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy, because he inclined his ear to me. Therefore, I will call on him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed, even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? I will lift the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem. Praise the Lord. Verse 7 of this psalm is one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. If I were to ever have a headstone, I would want that verse on it because I think it's very fitting uh, as a description. I think God has dealt extremely bountifully with me in my life. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about Paul in Acts chapter 18. If you read the invitation that I sent out this evening, I mentioned on it that we might cover one whole verse in the book of Acts. I intended, and I still do, intend to cover verses 18 to 23, but I got sort of stuck in a rabbit hole in verse 18, and it is my intention this evening to drag you into that rabbit hole, kicking and screaming down with me, so that we end up getting lost looking at a topic that I've never studied before and I've never heard studied in another class. But first, let me read for you Acts 18, verses 18 to 23. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Cenchrea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all of the disciples. This is a transitioning part of the book of Acts. Paul has completed in verse 19 or 18 rather, he completes his ministry in Corinth, where we know that he stayed for a year and a half after he had been there, let's call it 9 months. The opposing Jews, drag him before Gallio, and uh, he doesn't get to plead his case. Gallio throws the case out of the court and has the Jews driven out, saying that he refuses, and by extension, Rome refuses to judge between the Jews and the Christians. giving Christianity equal footing with Judaism according to the way Rome was going to view it. And Rome had already legitimized Judaism as a uh, religion that could be practiced without molestation. And therefore, by extension, since Christianity is associated with or is a offshoot or a sect of Judaism, Christianity too becomes a legitimate religion that can be practiced without interference by people, and that carries the weight of the Roman Empire behind it. It won't be long until Christians are persecuted. Nero is going to come into power. Nero is going to want to establish a um, circus for himself in Rome proper, and to do so, he has to get rid of a stable, which, at least according to Roman historians who are writing around this period of time when these things take place. He had it set fire to. That fire got out of control. Much of Rome burned. Legend says that Nero fiddled as Rome burned, but um, that comes from a misreading, I think, of one of these Roman historians who writes of Nero looking on as the city is burning. Nero blames the Christians, and tremendous amount of persecution erupts because of that. But that's really applicable if you're going to study the book of Mark and understand why Mark writes the gospel that he writes and why there's a sense of urgency in Mark's gospel that you see in it. But as I was reading through these verses this week and beginning to prepare for this class, I got stuck on the last sentence of verse 18. At Cenchrea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. Luke doesn't give us any details what this vow entailed, but I think we can make educated guesses from what he does tell us, both of the fact that he's cutting his hair and what we know from the um, Macedonian and Achaean steps of the second missionary journey that we've been studying these last several weeks. We know that Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 2 to 5, when he's writing to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And coming on the heels of his debate in the Areopagus in Athens, where he was before men of wisdom, men of learning, and he's trying to make a defense of the gospel there and teach them about this unknown God that they don't know, but they worship. Paul, in leaving Athens and crossing the Bay of Corinth and coming into Corinth, resolves to know nothing but Jesus and him crucified. He has suffered physical abuse in Philippi. He was imprisoned in Philippi. He was rejected in Thessalonica and driven out of town there. His opposition followed him from Thessalonica down south to Berea, where he once again encountered those men coming down and stirring up the crowds and chasing him away. He comes into Athens and is dismayed by the number of idols that he sees. So Paul has had a hard time in this ministry in trying to spread the gospel message in Macedonia. He had heard the Macedonian call while he was still on the other side of the Aegean Sea in Troas. And so he responds to that call, and every step of the way has been an uphill battle for him. Except in Berea, the Jews there they received the word with eagerness, but he wasn't able to stay there long because the jerks from Thessalonica followed him down there and caused trouble for him. And Paul had to leave Macedonia. So he ends up in Athens. It's shortly after we read in Acts 18, where we were last week. Paul leaves the synagogue in verse 6. The Jews were opposed to the message. The unbelieving Jews were opposed to the message. They blasphemed him. He shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." We know from reading in Romans, you read Romans 9 through 11, and you know that Paul had a heart for the Jews. Paul was a Jew. He loved the Jewish people. He wanted desperately for the Jewish people to embrace Christ, to become Christians, to believe in the message of the gospel. Just a second here. He wanted very much for his own people to become Christians, to the point that he writes in Romans that he says, I could wish myself accursed and cut off from Jesus if it meant their salvation. And so the fact that the Jews here in Corinth repudiate him, and Corinth, very large city, has a large community of Jews, and this audience that should have been very receptive to the message that, hey, the Messiah, the Messiah that we've been looking for centuries finally came, Jesus of Nazareth. They should have joyfully embraced that message. Instead, they reviled Paul. So it has to be with some frustration that he turns to the Gentiles. We're told in Acts 9 that when Paul is converted to Christianity, God tells Ananias, the fellow who goes in and baptizes Paul, Jesus says, "I'm going to show him how much he has to suffer for my name." But Paul's a man, like any of us. Paul's a human being. We can only take so much rejection and abuse and frustration before it begins to wear on us. I think all of us have our limits. And so I think Paul is very frustrated by what he has encountered, and maybe disillusioned in his ministry, which I think is why we have this vision in Acts chapter 18, verses 9 and 10. Jesus says to Paul in the vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." And I think it's at that point that Paul may have made this vow that we read about in verse 18. But what is the vow? I don't think I've ever sat in a class that has talked about vows to any degree of depth. And so I started looking at this topic, and as I said at the top of this class, I started looking at this topic and I fell into a rabbit hole, and I began chasing this topic out. And so tonight we're going to be looking mostly in the Old Testament, or much of the Old Testament, much of the time in the Old Testament, at vows and what vows are, and the differences between a vow and an oath or a promise, with an eye to answering the question, do vows have a place in the life of a Christian today? Are vows still a thing that we can enter into? And if so, to what end? To accomplish what ends? And so that's where I'm intending to take us. I only have 2 pages of notes, but they're typewritten, so that's almost the equivalent of 3 pages handwritten. So it might be a short class, but I spend an awful lot of time on the introduction. And I've said before that we'll have a short class, and it never works out, does it? The word vow appears 75 times in the English Standard Version of the Bible. 72 of those times are in the Old Testament, meaning there's only three uses of it in the New Testament. Two of those are in the book of Acts, here and in Acts chapter 21, verse 23, which we will get to in some weeks yet. And the remaining one is in Mark when Herodias dances for Herod, and he's so taken with the dance that he vows to give her up to a third of his kingdom or half of his kingdom or whatever, whatever her request of him is. And she asks, of course, for the head of John the Baptist. So I want to look at vows and oaths, what the differences are. We know from Numbers chapter 6, way back here in the Old Testament. And by Numbers 6, of course, I mean Numbers 30. Yeah, Numbers 30. Sorry to those of you taking notes. I hope you can make that 6 into a 30. Verse 30. That's not the right verse. Why is that not the right verse? I wrote it down. I'm looking it up here, and it's not. It's because it's verse 2. It's Numbers 30, verse 2, not Numbers 30, verse 3. This is what happens when you write your notes in a hurry and you don't proofread them. There's a lesson in there somewhere about doing things in haste. Um, Bill Moore can present it someday. Numbers 30, verse 1. Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the people of Israel, saying, This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Breaking of a vow or an oath was forbidden to the Jews in the Old Testament. One Jewish source that I read says that the difference between a vow and an oath, he calls it technical. He says that a vow refers to an object, a thing or an activity or an object that a person is going to prohibit to themselves, deny themselves of for a period of time, such as a vow of poverty or a vow of chastity or a vow to abstain from wine, things like that. Whereas an oath has to do with a person. I promise to do such and so for Gail, or I promise to do such and so for Peter, and I make an oath swearing by something. And we know what Jesus says about that. And we'll get to those verses shortly. A couple of examples of these that you can find in 1 Kings chapter 19. The prophet Elijah in chapter 18 had his triumph on Mount Carmel against the prophets of Baal and the prophets of the Asherah. And it ended up in him having them all taken down to the river and executed, so that Jezebel lost all of her prophets in one day, Jezebel being the wife of King Ahab. In 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 3, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, and here's the oath. So may the so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid. He arose and ran for his life. But that's the oath. Elijah, I swear by this time tomorrow you're going to be dead too. It didn't work out for her. Later on, she's going to die. One of my favorites here, and this is kind of humorous. It's in Acts chapter 23. We have an oath. Some opponents of Paul decide that they're going to kill Paul. And we read in verse 12 of Acts 23, when it was day, and we'll get to this later when we study this chapter, and I'll go into it more detail then, but here just for the humor of it. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now, therefore, you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near." This plot gets made known to Paul, and Paul escapes. I wonder if those men held true to their oath and simply starved themselves to death because they were unable to fulfill that oath. Are they so strong in their conviction that they should not break their oath? I like to eat. Most of you who have met me in public or have met me in person know that I like to eat. I'm not making an oath to not eat until I've killed somebody because I want to eat. I don't want to kill anybody really, but I want to eat. I don't think these men held to that oath. It's just my thought. So I want to look at some vows in the Old Testament. We really have two types of vows. There are obligatory vows, such as we find in the covenants that God makes with Israel at Mount Sinai, um, and in Deuteronomy, in Exodus 19 through 24. God descends on Mount Sinai in flame and in dense cloud and fire and smoke, and he makes a covenant with Israel. And that covenant is reiterated in Deuteronomy when they go up on the Mount of Blessing and they go up on the Mount of Cursing, and they're speaking the blessings for keeping the covenant and the curses for breaking the covenant. An obligatory vow is conditional. It's conditioned on the obedience of the Jews. We are in a conditional covenant with God right now. You who have been baptized, you have confessed Jesus as Lord of your life. You've been buried in baptism. Your sin has been washed away. And now you are, as Paul writes in Romans 6, we rise to walk in newness of life. We're free at any time to go back to the old ways, to abandon the path that we're on and go walk in a path of sin. If we walk away from God, he is under no obligation to honor the covenant and take us up to heaven when Jesus comes again, because we've turned our back on him. My behavior there does not force God to say, can't do anything about it. My hands are tied. There are consequences for walking away from Jesus. And I know that all of you know people who have walked away, who were in a right relationship with God and have left it and walked away for whatever reason. There are consequences for that. Then there are the promissory vows, such as the covenant that God gave Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and to David in 2 Samuel 7. These are unconditional. God said to David in 2 Samuel 7, "A descendant of yours will sit on the throne forever." Some of the kings that came after David were good kings. You had King Asa, you had King Uzziah, you had King Jotham, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, and there were others in there. I'm not naming all of the good kings who walked as best they could, patterning themselves after David, who was the man after God's own heart. There were some pretty bad kings of Judah, though. I can think of two off the top of my head. You had Ahaz, the son of Hezekiah, who was a good king, and you have Manasseh. Manasseh was a horrible, human being, a terrible king. He did more evil in Judah and in Jerusalem than probably Ahab did in the northern kingdom, and that's saying quite a lot. He did repent at the end. He repented hard, and he repented fully. And I believe he did everything he could in his power to undo all the harm he had done. But God said, no, it was too little, too late. He was going to bring Babylon in and destroy Jerusalem. But despite the fact that Judah had bad kings, a descendant of David currently sits on the throne and reigns forever. His name is Jesus. We all know him. That covenant was unconditional. God swore that oath. God swore the oath to Abraham, the covenant to Abraham, that in his seed all mankind would be blessed. That's come about. We're living that. We are his descendants, the spiritual descendants of Israel. So let's look at a few of these covenants here real quick. The first one we run into is in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 28. Did I say covenants? I meant vows. We're looking at vows. Genesis chapter 28, beginning in verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. This is reiterating the covenant, the promise that he made with Abraham. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. Of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Jacob's making a vow. If you will honor that promise you made me, if you will keep me safe as I go to see my uncle Laban, then when I come back in safety to my father's house, you will be my God. I will serve no other gods. And and I'll give you a tenth of everything that you bless me with. I'm going to read a couple more, three more, two more vows. I'll reference a third, but I want to read at least two of them because I see a pattern set up in how these vows are worded. And I think that has some bearing on what Paul is doing in Acts. This is all relating back to Acts. It really is. I may not tie it fully back there to your satisfaction, but you're free to study this on your own and spend more time in the rabbit hole, just like I did. I can even give you the word study books, and you can go crazy with it. Let's look at Jephthah's vow in Judges chapter 11. This is a tragic vow. If you know the history of the book of Judges, Carrie's been teaching from Judges. In fact, he just finished the book of Judges this past Sunday. Judges is a brutal kind of book. But in Judges chapter 11, beginning in verse 29, then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, And he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. I think that's as far as I really need to read. You can read down through the rest. Um, God does give him the Ammonites into his hand, and Jephthah comes home in triumph, and his daughter comes dancing out of the house to meet him and brings him low because of the vow he had made. And there is a ton of ink spilled in debates over whether or not Jephthah offered his daughter up as a burnt offering to the Lord. My opinion is that yes, he did. That's what he vowed. He carried out his vow. As reprehensible a thing as that is, he did that rather than break his vow to God. And you can debate it later. Um, and Peter Archibald can teach a class on it and explain exactly why Jephthah did as he did. You're on notice there, Peter. Let's look at Hannah in First Samuel. First Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. Hannah is married to Elkanah, who is a good man. He had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah. Peninnah has children. Hannah does not. Elkanah prefers his wife, Hannah, or it seems to have preferential feelings toward her, but the other wife makes her life miserable. And so we read in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9, after they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give you to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. She's saying to God, if you give me a son, I'll make sure he's a Nazarite from birth, and I will give him to you. I will give him to the Lord. And she carries that out. After the child is weaned, she brings the child to Eli and says, I'm the woman who was praying. You saw me praying. You thought I was drunk. I was praying for the son. God gave me the son. Here you go. I'm giving him to the Lord. And her husband allows her to do this because she vowed the vow. Numbers 30, verse 3, that I didn't read after. If a wife makes a vow and the husband knows about the vow, then the vow is binding on the wife. And I'm pretty sure she explained to her husband what was going on here. You can read about Absalom. Absalom uh, made a vow, or at least purportedly made a vow in 2 Samuel 15, verses 7 and 8. I don't know if he did or if he's using this as a device to separate himself from David so that he can begin stealing the kingdom from his father. I think the latter, but that's because I'm kind of cynical and I don't think nice things about Absalom. He was a scheming scoundrel, and I think he was a scheming scoundrel from the beginning. The book of Leviticus is full of laws on vows. We're not going to look at all of them, but I do want you to look in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 6. Now we're going to Numbers 6 because I mentioned we were going to go there earlier, and I fooled you and went to Numbers 30 instead. But if you look at Numbers 6, beginning in verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord. He shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat grapes, fresh or dried. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. All the days of his separation no razor shall touch his head. Say that 3 times fast. Until the time is completed for which he separates himself to the Lord, he shall be holy. He shall let the locks of his hair on his head grow long. You can tell I'm not under a Nazirite vow. All the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, not even for his father or his mother or brother or sister. If they die, he shall make himself unclean, because of his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation, he is holy to the Lord. If you skip ahead to verse 18, you can start in verse 13, but I'm going to pick it up in verse 18. What do you do when the vow is completed? Verse 18 says, And the Nazirite shall shave his consecrated head at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair from his consecrated head and put it on the fire that is under the sacrifice of the peace offering. So his hair is offered as a sacrifice before the Lord. This seems to be what Paul is doing in Acts chapter 18. He has his hair cut in Cenchrea. He goes, well, I read it for you, didn't I? Or yeah, he goes from Cenchrea to Ephesus, but does not stay there. He wants to stay there, but he does not stay there because he has something he has to do first. And we're told he sails from Ephesus and arrives at Caesarea. And from Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church. When you find that phrase in Palestine, if you're going up, it means you're going to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is at a higher elevation. People would go up to Jerusalem. We know this because in Rome, we're studying the Psalms of Ascent. They're so named because you are making your ascent toward Jerusalem. And as you, the Jew on pilgrimage, are making your ascent toward Jerusalem, you're singing those psalms that are listed in the book of Psalms as the Psalms of Ascent. So Paul is taking the hair to Jerusalem, where he is going to have it offered. He's going to make the peace offering at the temple and have the hair burned up with the peace offering. He's only going to stay there long enough to fulfill the vow, and then he's going to greet the church, as it says, and he's going to go to Antioch, where he stays for some time before making the overland journey back to Ephesus. There, we've covered verses 18 to 23, like I said we would, but I'm still stuck on the topic of vows. There are some warnings about vows in the Old Testament. Let's look at 3 of them real quick. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5. Again, I did not proofread my notes because Proverbs 20, verse 5 is not the verse I'm looking for. And I don't see it here in front of me. I know it's in Proverbs. Don't be quick to vow rashly and then regret it later. Have you ever smelled burning hair? Yes, I have smelled burning hair. It does not smell pleasant. I agree with you. Very much so that it does not smell very pleasant. We'll move on from the book of Proverbs into Ecclesiastes 5, because I know at least these verses are correct. I'm sorry. I thought I had taken better care in writing down the verses that I was wanting to look at. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 1. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Draw near to listen. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not even know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you vow and not pay. This is a warning. Think before you speak. Be careful in what you vow before God. Don't be rash with your promises. Malachi chapter 1. Verse 14, Malachi 1:14. Cursed be the cheat who has a male in his flock and vows it, and yet sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished. For I am a great king, says the Lord of hosts, and my name will be feared among the nations. Be careful what you speak of. There are verses in the Old Testament talking about oaths and swearing. Genesis chapter 25, verse 33, when Esau came in famished from hunting and Jacob was making lentil soup. I love lentil soup. Good lentil soup with crusty bread and butter. Good stuff. But as much as I love it, I'm not going to give up my birthright. Well, I guess I don't. I'm an orphan now. Both my parents are dead. I would not have, before they had died, I'm an only child too, so this is really not an applicable example to me. I would not have rashly promised something for a bowl of lentil soup. Esau says, I'm dying. Give me some of that. Give me some of your soup. And Jacob says to him, give me your birthright first. Let me have the portion of the firstborn. Esau says, I'm about to die. What good is it to me? And so he promises it to Jacob. He swears a promise to Jacob. Yes. He eats the soup, and the writer of Genesis tells us, thus he despised his birthright. Genesis 50 and verse 24, Joseph, when he's dying, makes the Israelites promise on oath when they leave Egypt to carry his bones with them so that he would not be buried finally in Egypt. Jesus, Matthew 7, I promised we'd get here. Matthew 7. Has escaped my attention. This is what I get for going too fast. Huh. And by Matthew 7, I mean Matthew 5. I was not best prepared for this class, does it show? Matthew 5, verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Jesus says, I don't have to, when if Bill Moore comes over to my house, I don't have to say, Bill, I swear by the bones of my ancestors that I'll make you coffee. First off, Bill knows if he's coming over to my house, I'll make him coffee. If I say, Bill, come on over, you'll have a cup of coffee. Bill's not going to come doubting. Will he really do that? He didn't swear by anything. Jesus says, let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Hebrews chapter 6. The writer of Hebrews makes an interesting statement. We don't swear by anything, but in Hebrews 6, verse 13, when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you, and I will multiply you. Thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that's set before us. So back to Acts 18, and I want to leave just a couple of minutes for discussion here. Paul vows a vow. My opinion, okay, please understand, my opinion, not scripture. I am extrapolating from what I'm reading here, and I'm reading a lot into it. I think that Paul followed the pattern that we saw in the Old Testament vows. There was an if statement. If you, then I. If you, Lord, do X, then I do Y. It's what Jacob said. If you will keep the promise that you made to me, then when I come back, you'll be my God. I'll give you a tenth of everything. Hannah says, if you'll give me a son, then I'll give him back to you, and he'll be a Nazarite all the days of his life. And Jephthah, you give me victory, then I will offer you what comes out of my door to meet you. I think Paul gives an if-then sort of promise here. Jesus gives him this vision, this promise. No one will attack you to harm you. And so I think Paul picks up on that and makes a vow separating himself to be holy to the Lord, this vow of the Nazarite, and says, if you'll do that, then I will pay the what is prescribed in the law under this vow. I will go and I will make that peace offering to show my appreciation for the promise that you have carried out. That's what I see Paul doing here. There, in Jewish literature, there is an entire, if you've heard of the Babylonian Talmud, if you've never heard of it, don't worry about it. It's a collection of Jewish traditions and teachings of the elders of the Jews, that the Jews held to it like this is of equal weight with the law of Moses and all the sayings of the prophets. There was an entire volume of that dedicated out of the, I think it's 10 to 14 volumes. One entire volume is dedicated to traditions about vows and how important vows were to the Jewish people. They were making vows frequently. You read through the Psalms are full of the psalmist saying, I am going to fulfill my vows to you, Lord. So when we consider vows from a Christian point of view, we might think of the wedding vows, when we promise to love, honor, and roll our eyes at our spouse's jokes. But do vows go further than that? I really think that Paul makes his vow in the vein of, if you keep me safe from harm, then I will offer you the peace offering of the Nazarite vow, because it's easy to not cut your hair. And it was probably somewhat easy to abstain from wine and products of the grapevine. And Paul has his hair cut in Cenchrea, and then I believe he goes to Jerusalem and he offers it up there with the rest of the sacrifices. So what about us? Do vows have any place in our walk with God? I want to make 3 points before I open up the floor for a couple of minutes of discussion here. I think that vows, like fasting, are intensely personal. Meaning, if Peter Archibald makes a vow for some reason, he does not stand up in the assembly of the Albany congregation and announce at the top of his lungs, I have made a vow to God. And it's a private matter, and I'm not going to talk about it. Because it's a private matter, so he's not going to talk about it. But neither is he going to make everybody in the world aware that, hey, I've made this vow. Secondly, I think that I cannot use, if I am making a vow to God, I cannot use my obedience or my worship of him or things like that as a bargaining chip. I can't promise God, Lord, if you will do something for me, then I will obey you. I will surrender my life to you. I will worship you. I'm already in a covenant relationship with God. Those things are incumbent on me. It'd be sort of like the child saying to the parent, I'll obey you if you give me a cookie. I'm sorry, you're my child. A child's duty is to obey their parents. You will obey me whether you get the cookie or not. If you don't obey me, you're certainly not getting the cookie. So I don't think we can use things like that as a bargaining chip when we enter into a vow with God. So let's say I lose my job and I want another job. And I approach God and I make a vow, Father, if you will lead me to another job that I can earn my keep and help support my family. I can make a vow along the lines of, Lord, if you'll do that, then I. And that then I needs to be something that I'm not already under obligation to offer to God anyway. I could say something along, because if you read in the Old Testament, the laws in Leviticus, vows and free will offerings go hand in hand. Because nobody is putting a gun to my head and making the offer of make a vow to God. This is a thing I do of my own volition. It's a thing I do of my own free will. Then and it's a thing that I can say, then I won't eat lunch for a month, and I'll devote that time to prayer. Or I'll set my alarm an hour earlier every day for a month, and I'll get up and I'll devote that time to prayer. Something that I'm not compelled to do. Or I'll open up my home once a month and invite everybody in, and we'll sing and we'll feed. Well, wait, I already do that. So my question to you, and uh, we'll discuss this for a little bit before I end this class. I haven't really pinpointed a good answer to this. Do vows have a place in the Christian life? Christine wrote, if we were to make vows, if then, in that if then way, it sort of negates our faith and the deep meaning of it. To a point, yes. But like fasting, vows call attention to a deep need. Hannah prayed out of distress and a deep need to have a child, and offered him back to the Lord as a statement of, here's my faith. Also, I like cookies. I'm not skipping lunch for a month, and I don't do early mornings. I'm with you there. I don't do early mornings either. So, do vows have a place in the Christian life? And if so, how? The floor is yours. Please unmute yourselves and discuss freely here while I drink my iced tea and marvel in your and revel in your wisdom.
I think vows can be something that we use to help focus our mind.
I agree. because I see them a lot. They're an awful lot like fasting. Yes, fasting is about dedicating time to God. Yes. But a vow can be along those lines too for a specific purpose.
Because fasting isn't only used for giving honor to God,
Right. Fasting can be a self-discipline.
right?
Because maybe abstaining from the cookies could be good for you and you learn self-control. Where do wedding vows fall into this? Well, I mentioned that earlier. The wedding vow is definitely you are entering into a covenant relationship with your partner, and you are making a promise before God that, as I said, you'll love, honor, and roll your eyes at their jokes, but it goes more serious and deeper than that. She insists she's not
That's
abstaining
okay,
from cookies.
Christine. Denial is not just a river.
It's probably not a question that you can answer this evening, but I think it's something worth thinking about. If nothing else, I can have the pleasure of knowing I've left you stuck down in the rabbit hole, pondering the topic.
Beside my wedding vows, I don't think I made a vow, but I've made oaths. When I served on a jury, you have to make an oath.
Yep. And if you stand on a witness stand in court, I'm renewing my driver's license this year. No, not this year, next year. I have to have it renewed by June. And I noticed at the bottom of the DMV form, there's the place where you sign, and above that form, it's over there. I could read it to you, but I'm not going to get up and get it. But it says, I swear that the information in this,
Oh,
or by signing this, I'm attesting that the information in this document is true. That I'm not making any false statements about who I am. And that's an oath. I'm taking an oath to the Department of Motor Vehicles in New York State that I am indeed Matthew Stewart Braemiller, and I reside at 3 Rapple Drive in Colony.
Oh.
But like I said, something to ponder. Now that I realize I've just given my
I just did
name and
that.
address to all of YouTube, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.